Today is a great podcast because I'm joined by a returning guest who was on Things Hidden a while back, Zak Slayback. How are you, sir?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me, David.
So you're the one of the proprietors behind the 1517 fund, and you're
Oh,
known.
I'm one of the partners, and I wouldn't
Okay.
call myself a proprietor.
Okay, so you didn't create it, but you're a partner, and that's good enough for me. Zak, tell us a little bit about how you got into the entrepreneurial space first.
Sure. Yeah, I was on the founding team of a company some years ago that was targeting taking young people who don't have credentials and placing them in jobs that required those credentials, typically a bachelor's degree. So we would take something like an 18-year-old and place them at a company, train them up, give them some skills, polish them up, and then set them up with some interviews with some outstanding companies that otherwise they wouldn't even be able to get their foot in the door because the company's website might say that they require a bachelor's degree. Um, Best example of this, this was just like a scales fall from my eyes kind of moment. Was I was doing the business development for this company for a while, and I was meeting with the proprietor of an ad agency in Phoenix, Arizona. They had offices all over the country, but they were headquartered in Phoenix at the time. Fairly large company by terms of like SMBs, doing a good chunk of revenue. And before I'd go into a lot of these meetings, I would sit down with like the job description and try to get a sense for what they're trying to get at. Because job descriptions, there's often like a qualification behind the qualification, in the same sense that somebody may ask you a question, but there's a question behind the question. So by saying something like we want 3 years of this kind of experience, they're really looking for a certain level of conscientiousness and a certain level of tacit knowledge that is picked up in those first 3 years.
Mhm.
They had in all the job descriptions bachelor's degree in marketing, business administration, or advertising, something like that, or equivalent work experience. And this was somewhat common at the time. It's much more common now, the bachelor's degree or equivalent work experience. This was, maybe a little bit less than 10 years ago. And I asked he was either the president or the CEO. They were different people in this company. But I asked this gentleman, I think he was the CEO, what does equivalent work experience mean? Thinking that what he would say is, 4 years, right? Maybe 5 years. On average, the average amount of time it takes to finish a bachelor's degree in the United States is about 5 years. And he looked at me and he's like, 3 months of work, maybe 6 months of work. And I was already kind of on board with this stuff, but even that was kind of jarring to even me. And I was like, wait. You're telling me 3 to 6 months of work is roughly the same as 4 to 5 years at Arizona State over there, right? Because we were in Phoenix. And he said, yeah, I think I can train somebody in about a summer to get about as much knowledge as they get in their 4 or 5 year degree at a place like Arizona State. And that was an enlightening experience because that's often really what those credential requirements meant. So fast forward some time, through working in that area, I end up interacting with the folks behind the Teal Fellowship. This is Peter Thiel's program to pay young people under the age of, at the time it was 20, I think it's been up to something like 23 now, $100,000 to stop out of school, not go to school, something like that, and work on their startups. And the team there ended up launching 1517 after a couple of years. And I ended up joining the team there around the beginning of the second fund. So we're on our third fund right now. It's an $80 million fund. We're making investments across a lot of different categories. Our fundamental thesis is that we back what I call dropouts, renegades, and deep tech or mad scientists. So we're really trying to find those people that your traditional VCs are not going to pay as much attention to because they want to take the meetings with, the Stanford GSB grads instead.
What's some of the maddest scientists that you've encountered so far?
Um, my favorite one, I mean, we've got a lot of interesting folks. The most prominent one would be a quantum computing company called Atom Computing. They're one of the major players in the quantum computing space today. Um, we recently backed Fusion Company as another example. A young man who's trying to take a third way with fusion. Typically, there's two main ways that one goes about achieving nuclear fusion, but he believes that there's a third path forward, through which you can use lasers and organic molecules, such as hydrogen molecules, to build a fusion reactor.
And this is the
My
traditional hot fusion or tokamak or a different model?
It's a completely different category. The research on it should work. Like, it's one of these things that when
It's not LENR, low energy, right?
I don't believe so. No.
Yeah.
But it's one of these things that when you're looking at the research and you're sending it to the researchers who specialize in this, they look at it and they say, I don't see any reason why it won't work. No one's done it yet, though, which is actually the best kind of response you want. Or we have a young man, for example, who, and some of these founders, the deep tech founders in particular, some of them do have credentials, but this one doesn't. As an example, we have a young man who is working on curing diabetes, type 2 diabetes. He was working on this in his parents' basement, while he was in school, ended up stopping out of school to go full time on this. And we funded some of his research studies.
Spoiler alert, stop eating seed oils. That's how you do it.
That's a big part of it, but there are some people who therapeutic is ultimately what they're going to need. But
what's his idea? Can you share it, or is it not ready to go public?
I can't share the specific details of it.
It's no seed oils. That's what it's got. He's going to come out with a great book teaching you how to not eat seed oils.
No, but he's brilliant. One of these people that no traditional investor would take seriously, especially in the therapeutics and biotech space.
Why?
The investors in that space they tend to be very heavily clustered in Boston, Massachusetts, which has its own specific kind of culture to it. They tend to be very risk averse and conservative. It takes about 10 years, $900 million for a therapeutic to get to market. I kind of understand why they want to be risk averse, but they're fairly risk averse. They're pretty conservative. They want to see a team of, Harvard and MIT PhDs, somebody on the team with some gray hair, ideally some clinical background experience. This founder, on the other hand, I think he was 20, maybe 21 when we started talking to him. Solo founder, which we don't usually back, but brilliant and able to get a lot of work done on his own. It just one of these people who you have to sit down and say, I'm going to take this person seriously when no one else in their space is going to take them seriously. And through taking them seriously, you often run into what we call this kind of dilemma where we can't tell if a founder is crazy or crazy awesome. And in his case, the line was very thin. We really weren't sure, but we said, okay, we'll take a small amount of money, in this case, $50,000, I believe. We'll invest it in his company, and we'll use that just to help him get a little bit of validation or prove that he's completely insane. We were leaning towards he's crazy awesome, but we want to see, right? And he comes back after that $50,000 and with evidence that he's probably cured type 2 diabetes in mice. So that's a good sign that we will continue to follow on and support him. So those are just some examples of the deep tech and mad scientists that we've backed.
So you guys are trying to find these little misfits and stuff, and you have to use a certain mimetic art, because you have to go against your mimetic programming to be averse to people who are shunned socially or not fit in socially. But you can't go the opposite where you fetishize that antisocial characteristic and then you start backing stuff that's just stupid and doesn't work. And that's a hard art to do. Because you have to go against that natural impulse that the herd kind of puts into us to avert and move away from the misfits and the odd ducks and the ugly ducklings and the contrarians and the people who are supposedly different or crazy, because your mimetic wiring teaches you to kind of not get too socially connected to those folks, because they can be excluded and you can be excluded by extension, by planting your flag with a bunch of socially maladjusted folks.
Oh, certainly. Like we'll tell some of the stories of some of the founders that we've worked with. And I think just like I'll give you an example, actually. This was not intentional, but my colleague, Michael, who you've had on the show, was here in the Delaware area a couple of weeks ago on a panel at an organization. And it was a New York Times columnist. a defense researcher, guy that runs a defense think tank, and then Michael on stage. And they were going through and doing the introductions, and Michael starts to explain what we do. And there's this gentleman.
Michael was doing like Trump does. Nope. On the mic. Nope.
Well, he was
wrong.
It was a very cordial panel, actually. But he was kind of explaining what we do, and there's a gentleman way off in the distance who was laughing hysterically at something else. But he kind of paused and he's like, "Yeah, it is actually pretty funny, right? Because it's not typically what you would expect when it comes to how one would do this investing in general, but especially not the very, very early stage stuff. Very early stage stuff is so risky. It makes a ton of sense if you are just thinking about it in a vacuum to index on credentials. But the reality is everyone else is going to index on credentials, and people know that you index on credentials. So you're going to get a lot of false positives. I believe more false positives by indexing primarily on credentials in most verticals.
And by indexing on credentials, you mean looking and selecting for people with credentials, right?
Yeah, I mean, ceteris paribus, you have two teams. One team has no credentials. One team has Stanford, Harvard, whatever, and you go with the Harvard team. I actually think you're going to, at this stage, I think you're actually going to make more mistakes with that model. But I understand why in the abstract somebody would think that I'm completely wrong.
Right. And is that because of the elusive nature of power? How Harvard and all these places have power, and Curtis Yarvin talks about this idea of power all the time, which is very fashionable in the new right conversations, that these institutions like not Silicon Valley, but Yale and Harvard and New York Times, they have all this power that you can't just defeat by getting a popular internet blog or website or even a Teal Fellowship. It won't overthrow it overnight, and so it's going to have this kind of juggernaut momentum that's not going to be.
I mean, to go back to the Mises point too. If you try to create an alternative to these things, they often end up becoming their own like power institutions in terms of the same kind of mimetic prestige, right? So people know that people will put extra weight on credentials. So because they know people will put extra weight on credentials, people who in my mind, probably signal the least raw talent in terms of those credentials will pursue those credentials most heavily, right? So if you know that people will over-index on certain credentials, I'm not totally anti-credential. There are some credentials I think are better than others, and those tend to be ones where the signal to noise ratio is much higher.
Like
they're hard. They're hard to get. They tend to be like guild-oriented credentials. The difficulty with guild credentials, though, often is that there's also some element of like regulatory capture involved. But you can imagine.
You're talking about like the credentials you get at your local Renaissance fair after you pass the blacksmith.
like what a professional organization might issue to people inside its orbit, right? Like the CPA might be an example. Credentials that are not super easy to get typically require some kind of experience. And they're like examination and or experience oriented. It's especially since we've seen this move towards getting rid of standardized tests in higher education and elite higher education institutions. It's surprisingly easy to just kind of like fake your way through 4 or 5 years of an undergraduate degree.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. When you talk about looking for madness and stuff, there's a certain romanticism that comes along with that. So how do you protect yourself from being bedazzled by your own desire to have that postcard with the next Nikola Tesla by your side?
Yeah, there's this section in 0 to 1 where it's towards the back of the book where Teal talks about different founders, and he gives the example of Howard Hughes is a great example, right? Like this kind of brilliant founder who had built all these amazing companies and ended up dying a madman after his plane crash, right? And it's not, it's not easy. I have learned from people who learned from people I've learned from people with thousands of data points of experience, some of their own mess ups along the way, and they learned from people who have thousands of data points of experience. So it is, at the end of the day, usually a judgment call, but you want to be able to sit back and say, like, okay, there are a couple of heuristics you might develop. Would I want to have Thanksgiving dinner with this person? Is one that we kind of use. I place character super highly on the list because a lot of people who might actually be brilliant, but be
Sneaky.
a little mad looking. If you don't have a very strong sense of their character, especially because they're going to be going against the grain for quite a while, they're going to go against the grain until they have the traction or the evidence to prove that they're not insane, is typically the way I think about it. In software, that's a lower bar than it might be in the hard
And
sciences.
what would be considered insane in software, for example?
I just mean founders who are like kind of outside the beaten path,
okay.
right? When you get a certain amount of traction, no one really cares, if you graduated from Stanford or not. They just care, like, can you build a product that people are using? Whereas in the hard sciences, it's a little bit harder. In life science in particular, it takes so long to get through some of these trials that people are going to, again, try to fall back on those credentials more. So that takes a long time. That's hard. In my mind, that difficulty is going to push even the best people to the brink at times. So you want someone who's very high character. That's really, and that's kind of like obscenity. I know it when I see it. But character is super important for my index.
And you're right. You do have to. I took a lot of, risk when I did my show, starting it off, and I had a few certain greatest hits that people expected me to talk about. But then when I brought in my friend Dr. Yu, who's a physicist, who's, I still believe, and I still bet what I do and my reputation on it, that his theory of physics is going to be the future of physics. But his physics theory is so it's so challenging to the fundamental cores of physics that you find out when you talk about bold and innovative and change the game and paradigm shifting and all these languages, there's layers of that. You go to one guy and he's like, yes, we need new physics. And you're like, okay, what does that look like? Well, it means string theory is not true. You're like, well, that's like layer one for me and Dr. Yu. We're way down here, man. We've already gotten rid of electrons. We don't have electrons where we're at, and our theory is more, and his theory is more simple and elegant. And it's got so much evidence. I've been doing this for 5 years with him, researching this. And it's almost too much. It's just almost too much. But we just try to steady pace and explain it every week we can. And I know that people who think, well, what is a guy in Florida who does talk riddle? What does he know about physics? And how could he how could he ascertain who the next Galileo game changer could be in physics? But it doesn't matter. At some point you just have to go with what you believe and your heart is right. And not in your emotions, but in your truly, what really seems to be true,
Well, what you'll see too is often throughout history, whether they're artists or intellectuals, some of the people who are most capable at presenting paradigm shifting, theories or approaches tend to be outside of the traditional institutions. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is just incentive wise. So for example, I was talking to some students this past weekend at a major university, and students had said, they were kind of having this conversation among themselves. Do we think that it will be easier to do science at this university in 10 years or harder to do science at this university in 10 years? And by do science, I mean do good science, advance some edge of knowledge. And unanimously, they all said it'll be harder for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons, for a variety of reasons. But I think one of the main reasons that people who are outside of these traditionally lauded institutions tend to be more capable of advancing these fields is incentives. If you're trying to become a tenure track professor somewhere, which is typically the only place you can do a lot of this work, then you have to make an advancement on this tiny, tiny little field inside your field. There's this fantastic graphic online, for example, you can find is like what getting a PhD is like, for example, where you see the circle and it's the field, it's the realm of all knowledge. And then there is your field, which is a tiny little circle inside of that. And then there's like, this circle kind of grows. So there's kind of like this pin that grows out from the circle. And if you zoom in really, really far, at the edge of the circle of all knowledge, there's a tiny little infinitesimal like bump. And it's like, that's your research. And that's just how the incentives are set up in the institution. It doesn't matter what field it is. Do you think that this is one of the bones I kind of have to pick, for example, with some of the like Catholic intellectuals who I really, really trust. I like, and I think that a lot of them are great thinkers and people, but they seem to be obsessed with this life of the mind, which I think is great. Like the life of the mind sounds wonderful, but I don't understand how that translates into the university system as we have it today. Do you think that if St. Thomas Aquinas were alive today, that he would be able to work on something like the Summa Theologicae if he was employed at like Notre Dame University, or University of Notre Dame? Do you think that he would be able to get tenure working on some of the stuff that he was working on? Probably not. He'd probably be trying to advance some tiny little element of Aristotle's thinking that, in this long line of Aristotelian thinkers. Do you think that any other like Renaissance era scientist or thinker, or medieval era scientist or thinker who probably was working in something that kind of looked like a university, an academy of some sort, do you think that they would be able to do that today in our current system? Absolutely not, because the incentives are not aligned to allow them to do that. And that's to say nothing about the effect of groupthink, which I think is more the element that you're getting at here, is that there's a strong element of, well, we don't do it that way because that's just not how it's been done. And we see this absolutely in a lot of the more heavy deep tech founders that we back, is we look for an element that we kind of call insider outsider, where they're an insider in the sense that they can grok the knowledge. And if I plunk them down with somebody who's, working at CERN on the Large Hadron Collider, they could talk to them intelligently.
Yeah.
They're an outsider in the sense where they probably weren't trained in the same institutions that the researchers at CERN were trained in. They probably didn't write the same kind of papers. And that allows them to challenge some of the assumptions that everyone else just kind of goes forward with. And this seems intuitive enough to people, but it exists in every field. The example that's just really live to me right now, because of the current market conditions, is 2008. You have these weirdos like Michael Burry, who's trained as a doctor, who just read online about how investing works. And, his brain's wired in a certain way. He's clearly, top decile, if not top percentile intelligence.
Right.
But he was trained as a medical physician, telling people 4 months before the collapse of the mortgage-backed securities market that the mortgage-backed securities market was going to collapse, because he was actually able, in part, to challenge some of the assumptions that people who were trained at Wharton and Kellogg and HBS weren't able to do. You see it in every field.
Right. Yeah. And the incentive structure is connected to the groupthink, right? Because you can't have that groupthink so powerful if you don't have, monopolistic funding mechanisms like government and their grant and all the different, revolving door nonprofits and foundations around government kind of monopolizing the funding mechanisms of these universities. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I think part of it
Excuse me.
how these university review boards work, how the university peer-reviewed journals work. Like, if you want to present like a new theory of physics, like, where do you publish?
Yeah, you can't. We had that interview with Dr. Michio Kaku and Dr. Yu, and Michio Kaku's like, well, just publish your papers in a peer-reviewed journal that we admire. And it's like, well, no, you're not going to get into the front door because we don't agree with the dogmas that you believe in.
the people inside the door take as a sign that you're a nut job. And maybe actually, like, to be charitable to the gatekeepers today, I am not saying that every single person outside of these institutions who has like a theory of something is sharp. I actually would argue that probably a lower percentage of the people outside of the institutions are very onto something compared to maybe the people inside. But the people who are outside who are onto something are far more impactful, and there's no way that most of them would be able to make it in the traditional institutions. And if they tried, they would be beaten down. They would be cut off at the knees, or they would either be beaten down, cut off at the knees, and maybe just become a traveling post-grad researcher somewhere forever, or they would have to alter their research in such a way that it's just so narrow that it loses the core of what they were originally working on.
That's what Thomas Kuhn says that most scientists are working on is, they're working within a given paradigm, and they're not questioning the paradigm. They're just working out little specialty, nuances.
Yeah. Another example is within philosophy, right? You see this infection of postmodern thought since the 1950s, and it's a great field because it's new. So like if you're a philosophy grad student, it's a great field because it's kind of new, and because it's kind of abstract, and it's kind of confusing to outsiders. So you can write papers that more or less don't really mean anything, and people will assume what you're talking about. You might be advancing some minuscule and infinitesimal tiny area of postmodern thought, but who's going to correct you on it, right? And in fact, there was a paper I'm forgetting on I think it was called the Sokol affair, or the Skokol affair, where some mathematicians wrote a gobbledygook paper, literally didn't mean anything. Like they wrote it up this postmodern paper and submitted it to some postmodern journal, and it was accepted. Yeah. And it was like it was not a small journal too. Yeah. And at this point, you can actually go online, and there are tools that aren't even like GPT-3 powered, relatively simple tools that will write you like short articles in postmodern speak that probably don't mean anything, but like they're grammatically correct. And you read them. If you're an outsider, you read them, and then you read like a normal paper within postmodern philosophy. It's difficult to tell them apart.
Right. Well, a lot of that, again, is you can look at it as a mimetic structure, because these are operating as kind of religious tribal structures, like you said, guilds or organizations that, in order to maintain your sense of self, because everybody within the group is competing with each other viciously, but in order to kind of maintain yourself in each other's positions in a sense of difference, you have to maintain certain faiths and dogmas that you guys all kind of hold dear, such that you can then expel heretics and scapegoats who run afoul of those dogmas, because you and me may be in deep rivalry, but in order to maintain our sense of self, we can always purge that weirdo, that couldn't get into our journal or into our field.
I mean, even less, if you look at these fields, they're very kind of dramatic and rivalrous. So, and all these people think that they're working on something very different than each other, but they're actually all very similar. So you get this mimetic doubling effect, right?
Yeah.
You have the object and you have the mediator, and they both want this like praise or this prize of being good at whatever they're in, and they think that they're differentiating themselves, but as they're competing to get the thing, they're actually getting more similar to each other. Yeah. So of course, academia and these research fields are so dramatic and catty, because any kind of community that lives like that, if it is going to need to have a single victim to expel in order to dissipate the chaos in the community.
And so that's why polymaths are very much out of fashion still, because they just don't fit anywhere. Like Rene Girard, I mean, he's considered an anthropologist, but by anthropologists, he's not. And by theologians will say, oh, he doesn't have his theology correct. Anthropologists say he doesn't have his anthropology right. The literary scholars would say he was breaking all the rules of literary analysis for novels, and so he's a misfit. It's as if he never even went to university as far as the specialists in those fields are concerned.
Well, I think Girard's interesting because in a certain sense, he's kind of a one-trick pony. Like doesn't really go afield. Like there are people like F.A. Hayek who have the economic calculation problem, and then they have like philosophy of mind, and they have constitutional theory, and they have all this stuff, right? And then there are people like Girard that kind of have like one thing they do, but they apply it to all these different fields, right? And I find them both fairly similar, and I don't think that Hayek was at Chicago and Girard was at the end of his life at Stanford, and I don't think that they would probably be able to do something like that today, because at the same time they're both kind of presenting this theory of everything just in its own different form. And again, no one really is able to do that anymore. And to the extent that they are able to do it, they're usually already way advanced in their careers and tenured professors and probably emeritus professors, and they're just kind of able to get away with it. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I think to be charitable to the critics, I think it does show like my critique I would have to some people is you and I were chatting before we started recording. It's like it seems like Girard's everywhere now. It can be over applied at times, and I think that's the danger. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something to be seen in it. That if this person were just trying to get ahead and say, yeah, anthropology or literary criticism today, we just absolutely wouldn't be able to.
Yeah. Well, I want to land the plane by going back to something we talked about when you last came on the podcast, which is I interviewed you about your recent conversion to Christianity and how it changed your view. Now, it's been some time in the faith since we last spoke. How are things going for you since then, since we last talked?
Oh, I'm good. It's very, very broad question. I don't know.
What I'm saying is, has your intellectual journey since you were just arriving in the faith when we talked? Now, I don't know, was it a year or two ago? 2 years ago?
It was probably about 2 years ago.
So 2 years of being a Christian now, how has your intellectual journey or your spiritual journey, has it changed anything from when you first got into it? Do you have a different angle now?
I've been able to go much deeper. I had the good fortune, I think probably right after you and I previously chatted, to study with someone who is one of the few very well trained and very well trained and knowledgeable Thomist thinkers probably in the world. I was recently speaking with him, asking him, where we were discussing, for example, the metaphysics of lying, right? The morality of lying and the metaphysics of it. And I asked him, okay, you've got this thesis that some of these major people that a lot of people are deferring to are wrong on this question. And you would say too, that these are people who would say, St. Thomas would say this, and you're saying, no, St. Thomas would say this, and he's right for XYZ reason. Where does this come from? And one of the things he noted to me was, well, he didn't do this in an arrogant way, but it's like, when you go and you study these things, and these are really, this is like, this is a case of like, okay, life of the mind, this makes a lot of sense. If you're trying to grok something like fundamental metaphysics of reality, you got to get the metaphysics right, and everything else follows from there. But if you get the metaphysics wrong, you're going to have dislocations everywhere else, yeah. Right? But he noted to me, he's like, yeah, when I was in Rome studying this, there were 2 people studying this at the advanced level, myself and another person. That was it. So, most other people, they're studying something much easier, right? So a lot of the problems, and we were talking a little bit about problems in the church, problems in society at large, problems in academia, almost all of them, David, come back to an overproduction of elites question. So, in the church, it might be you get too many people getting degrees that they actually don't need to be getting, and then they think that they need to apply them. And when they come home to try to apply them, they're messing with things that like, no, these things actually were like really quite good and worked really quite well. And then you don't have people going off and studying the important stuff, which would be like the the top level, or maybe maybe we want to call it the fundamental level stuff, like the metaphysics. And when they get the metaphysics wrong, they're going to, of course, get something in the ethics wrong.
Right.
So yeah, I've had the opportunity, thankfully, to go much deeper, and it's one of these things that for me is, as I talk to more people, I realize is probably more of an intellectual journey than for a lot of people it is, but it's the intellectual journey, and then maybe we might call it the non-intellectual, because I don't want to call it the intellectual versus the spiritual, because I think the intellectual is part of the spiritual. The intellectual, and then let's say the elements. What's we'll call it the right brain, maybe. Yeah, the right brain elements. As you advance in the intellectual, the right brain comes with it. So it's been just deeply gratifying. A couple of weeks ago, before you and I were chatting, I had the opportunity to spend a week at a Benedictine monastery in Oklahoma, for example, and a good chunk of that time was spent studying with a small group and this theologian I mentioned. But then also, so we're sitting there studying, say, the metaphysics of prayer, and then going to actually sit down with the 60 Benedictine monks and actually do prayer. The way that these things are, that this is a two-way street is, as you can tell, difficult to put into words. But deeply gratifying.
Well, in your study of scripture and the faith, have you changed your outlook on the future of America? Do you think America's future is bleak here? Or do you think that a deep renaissance is very much available to us if we go certain ways here?
I've been working on this piece. I'm going to indirectly answer your question. I've been working on this piece, which you will understand, and your devout listeners will understand what I mean when I say this. That a lot of our institutions, particularly our technological institutions around us today, are deeply satanic. And I mean that in the Girardian sense of whipping up mimetic rivalry and mimetic contagion, and then throwing that all upon a person. So I imagine, in the same sense that as globalization accelerates, it seems like we get bigger booms and busts, and they get more frequent. I think as technology, information technology in particular, I do somewhat buy the stagnation thesis that hard technology really hasn't progressed a lot. But as information technology accelerates, you're going to get bigger peaks and troughs of mimetic contagion, and more absurd examples of scapegoating. And if we can find a way to avert that or to minimize that, then I think that there's a great opportunity for a renaissance. But if we can't find a way to avert that, or at least to disinflate it, so reduce the rate at which it's increasing, I don't think it's a surprise at the end of his life that Girard was obsessed with the concept of the apocalypse. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Do you think it's about downsizing government and power out of our way, or is it about healing the culture, or something else? Or a lot of the fashionable new right people say you got to grab the power and consolidate it into a very strong executive branch and all this stuff. There's all these different ideas right now, and everybody's taking Christianity as a brand that they want to justify their actions with.
I think there are certain elements of the culture at large where there probably is something within the institutions that exist today that we could use to reduce their literally soul crushing effects. But I don't think that that's the main way of fixing these problems. I think the main way is fundamentally spiritual. I was, again, having this discussion with some students at a major university, and we kind of ended our conversation on, okay, like, what's to be done? I don't want to just end the conversation with like, yeah, we're barreling towards apocalypse. But like, what is to be done? And, there are, I think, some policy prescriptions you can make, but most of those are going to be prescriptions of like decentralization and subsidiarity primarily. But a lot of it's just on an individual level. Probably, for me personally, this sounds trite, but for me personally, I try to minimize the amount that I dunk on people on Twitter, right? And if you don't need to be on social media, you probably need to get off of it. And if you have children, don't allow them to get on it. Try to remove the power from the institutions that whip up these frenzies. And those institutions, some of them are public institutions, absolutely. But I think the public and the private go hand in hand. A great example is there was a diplomat of a country who is currently at war with another great power, who this diplomat tweeted out that it's so wonderful that the United States is going to help us defeat this great power. And the combination of just like sheer carelessness of what that can mean on an information technology platform like Twitter, I think is we haven't really explored.
Yeah. Well, Zak, we'll leave it there. Thank you again for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.